Aftermarket performance camshafts often produce an uneven idle which is accompanied by high vacuum.
That's that camera.
Is that true or is that false? When you say high performance camshafts, you're talking about lift and duration. They raise the, and there's various different ways you can do that. They raise the valve, they open the valve more, they hold it open longer. That changes the characteristics of the way the engine breathes. So, aftermarket performance camshafts will produce an uneven idle, which is accompanied by high vacuum. Is that true or is that false?
True.
Actually, well, let me tell you about this Bronco that had a Mustang engine in it. Yeah, stuffed a Mustang engine in this Bronco with a fuel injection and everything. And he wanted it to be a hot rod 302, so he cammed it up. And he had the map sensor and hooked up and everything, and it idled really rich when it was idling, and they were trying to figure out what to do about that. Now this guy had spent like $28,000 on his Bronco. You know, when you're hiring somebody, I'm not talking about like the Bronco we got, it's the old one, right. Like a 60, I'm sorry, the 73, I think. Back before they even started making these, they made a square, funky looking little thing. Mm-hmm. And so he sends it over there, and there's this mass airflow kit that he has me put on it. I talked about it before here. And I had to put the mass airflow kit on it because the map sensor at idle with this cammed up engine was reading low vacuum, and it was causing it to run too rich. So low vacuum is what you're going to get when you cam one up. Now the vacuum is going to be more normal when you're into it. When he was driving it, it ran just fine, but it puffed out a lot of black smoke when it was, you know, idling it, because the map sensor gives you engine load information, and if it sees low vacuum, it's going to put more fuel in there. That's just basically the way the map sensor algorithm is typed. So that one there is going to be a falsy. Ain't that right, Ben? Mm-hmm. The thickness of the head above the face of the valve is the margin. The thickness of the head above the face of the valve is the margin. Can anybody draw on the board for me what the margin is? Who sees the margin? You see the margin in your book there somewhere? This is a valve. All right. Now, whenever we put the valve in the valve grinding machine, we basically are going to be grinding this part right here where it seats, right? Every time you grind that seat, that margin gets a little thinner. So you're finding in the book that the margin is where? You see it right there, Ben? What's that showing you? What's that picture?
It's a picture labeling the valve.
That's right. So see the valve from the top. You see it like this. And what part of that is the margin?
What page you want, man?
Huh?
The
Laser it. What part's the margin?
right there.
Is that the margin?
I don't know, he's shaking a little bit. Let me see.
See if he can be he's from farther away, he'll have to hold it even stiller. That's the margin, right there. Got it? There's the margin.
Got him there to see him.
Brass Radio Shack $40 laser. And you can buy one a lot cheaper than that now. All right, so you got that. This one right here, incidentally, if you might notice, is bent.
Mm-hmm.
And see how when I tilt it, it's bent. You know why it's bent? Because the bolt come loose, and the valves hit the pistons in a 2002 Camry. All right, number 3. In preparation for valve removal, tap the valve stem in to loosen up any varnish.
Does that make 2 true?
Hmm?
Does that make 2 true?
Does it make what?
I got it.
In preparation for valve removal, you're supposed to tap the valve stem end. What's that going to do? That's going to tighten it, isn't it? because you got tapered keepers in there around them little grooves. So you're not going to do that. That's not what you're going to do. Now, what you might do is take a socket and put it on the valve spring and tap that to loosen the varnish. And you don't tap the end of the valve. Torque to yield bolts should be checked for wear and then reused if they're okay. False. You're not supposed to reuse torque to yield head bolts. This is from a 5.3 right here. And it looks okay, but that bolt has stretched. You're stretching that bolt, and it's an elastic thing. Now, typically, torque to yield bolts are used with aluminum cylinder heads. Typically. You don't usually use torque to yield bolts if you've got if you got a cast iron block, a cast iron head, you don't typically use torque to yield bolts as aluminum. Why would that be? And why do the head gaskets with aluminum heads typically have some graphite or Teflon on them? You ever think about that?
That's because the two different metals expand at different rates.
Right, expand and contract at different rates, and they're always scrubbing on the gasket all the time. But you're going to have this spring-loaded bolt, so that when you tighten it to, 44 foot-pounds or whatever, then you go a quarter of a turn and another quarter of a turn. And I got a torque angle gauge in there. We can use some of them, but you're going to do them the same. And a lot of y'all might know this too. You're supposed to loosen the cylinder head using a particular pattern on most of them nowadays on the newer engines, yeah. And there actually was a Ford training video that showed this guy loosening all of the intake bolts on a Ford Probe engine, and he didn't loosen them using the right torque sequence, and it warped the intake, and he couldn't even get it off the engine because he loosened it at the wrong. Now, I don't know how often that happens in the real world, but it's always something. I mean, I don't think I'd want to go there. Yeah, you start in the middle and you work your way out. I've noticed some people going from one end to the other.
I don't know about taking it off.
But
Probably about the same way.
it's best to follow what the manufacturer did. Well, taking it off, if it's an issue, the book will tell you to loosen it in this sequence. So if you look in your book, you'll know. Know that. All right, a visual inspection is often all that's needed to condemn a camshaft.
Condemn. What do you mean by condemn?
That means tell them, say it ain't no good. If you condemn something, when you walk in a building and it looks like it's may fall on your head any minute, you condemn it. Okay, this building's condemned, you put a sign on it, nobody can go in there. Well, you condemn a part. This EGR valve is junk. See what I'm saying? I've condemned this EGR valve. And it will not be used for an EGR valve unless I decide to put it on a vehicle for a bug and smack y'all around with it, okay?
In other words, nobody can go inside that HER, right?
That's right. They can never go in there anymore. Okay, now then, you've got your, let me tell you a little something here. That particular number 5 is what they say, a visual inspection is often all that is needed to condemn a camshaft. What are you looking for?
Bent.
Well, that's not usually what's wrong with the camshaft. What about rounded off lobes? Do you remember what the Aerostar did? Remember when he started the Aerostar up and he left the rocker arm loose and the rocker arm worked loose and it came off. And what did the engine do? You remember how it was running? What you heard, first you heard it clicking and then you heard it, every time that cylinder fired it was popping out the intake. So what happens, let me ask you this, why does it backfire into the intake when the, when the valves aren't working right? Think about it.
Valves aren't closed.
Yeah. What you need to recognize is the fact that there's enough atmospheric pressure difference between the top of that valve, where the air is coming in, and the combustion chamber, to where the combustion chamber can, on some vehicles, and a lot of them, as a matter of fact, pull that intake valve open when it's going down. Remember I told you that story about that truck that I was working on at when I was working at a truck and tractor place one time, a long time ago. And it was a V8, with a big fiberglass hood that folds forward. It's a 1.5-ton truck with 340 International engine, I think it was. Anyway, I checked the compression because it was skipping on one of the cylinders, popping out of the intake, and it was just skipping. So I checked the compression, and I got no compression whatsoever on the front cylinder on the right bank. And then I put oil in there, and when I rechecked it, I had 180 pounds. What was I telling you? No compression at all. I put oil in there, and all of a sudden I got 180 pounds.
Wear out piston rings.
Huh?
Wear out-
Sounds right, but 180 pounds from 0 to 180? Come on. Give me a break. If the piston rings are that bad, are they going to produce 180 pounds of compression? Well,
They probably wouldn't produce much of nothing.
well, I'm going to tell you what I did. I went to the guy and I says, look, apparently, I said what you just said. I said, we apparently got some piston ring problems. I went from no compression to 180 when I added oil. And so he called Rawls Warehouse, who owned the truck at the time, and they said, well, it's been 5-6 years since that truck's been rebuilt. Go ahead and put rings and bearings in it. Well, okay, so he said, build it. So I said, all right, we in-frame overhaul, basically, you know. So I pulled his valve cover off, and a push rod. They had apparently somebody had been driving a little too hard and they floated the valve, which means, you know, with push rod, it come off and was rattled down into the. And when I took that push rod and fished it out with my magnet, and put it back in place and tied it down, I had good compression. The engine ran smooth. That wet test, you know, and I went back to him. I said, look, we probably don't need to put rings and bearings in this thing because I found out what's wrong with it. I should have pulled a valve cover before I went and told him that. And I could have just fixed it real quick. But he's now, they've already told us we can overhaul this, go ahead and put rings and bearings. Well, you know, they needed to write it off anyway, so I put rings and bearings in it and all that. But anyway, the point is, one size doesn't fit all. Another story. I'm working at Lincoln Mercury in 1984, and there was a brand spanking new Grand Marquis come off the truck, skipping on cylinder number 3. And those had throttle body injection. All right, it's an 84 model car, had E4 on it, and the guys on the other side of the shop, the old men that, you know, was new engines so well, and I was over, you know, doing line mechanic work. I was doing electronics and all this other stuff, and some other line mechanic stuff. And they said, we have a bad camshaft on this car. There's no reason why it ought to be skipping on number 3. It's got everything it needs. It has to be a camshaft problem. And I'd never heard of that in my life. So I brought they said, we're going to go ahead and let him do it because these other guys snowed under. So they brought it over here, and I pulled the intake and the front of the motor off, and I pulled the camshaft out. I mean, I didn't follow through on the diagnosis. They told me what to do because it was under warranty anyway. They sent to the part house. They bought a perfect circle camshaft, and I held those two camshafts side by side, and I looked at them, and I measured the lift, and I looked at the duration and the indexing of that lobe and all. I could not visually tell you there was anything wrong with that camshaft. I just flat couldn't do it. I mean, I looked and looked and looked at it, trying to figure it out. I said, well, you know, they're the boss. I mean, I'll go ahead and put it in there, but it seems like a waste of time to me. You know, something else wrong with this car. So I worked the camshaft back in there, dropped the lifters back in, new gaskets, head, you know, timing chain, all this stuff. It ran so smooth. Now, the reason I went there was because it says the visual inspection is often all that's needed to condemn a camshaft. It doesn't say it's always. It says it's often. And that is true. It's often all that's needed. But you can't say that you can always condemn a camshaft. Sometimes a camshaft will look good and be bad. That's what I ran into, okay? Technicians can use a dye penetrant to check cast iron cylinder heads for cracks.
Don't
No, you're going to use Magnaflux for that, right? Okay. Number 7. The amount of clearance between the valve guide and the stem of the valve is typically A, 2 to 4 thousandths, B, 1.5 thousandths to 3.5 thousandths, or C, 1 thousandths to 3 thousandths, or 4 to 6 thousandths.
C.
That's going to be a C, isn't it? 1 to 3 thousandths. Technician A says valve guides may be integral to the cylinder head. Technician B says valve guides are usually cast iron or bronze. Who is correct about that? Both the guys are correct about that. Typically, if the valve guides are replaced, most of the time you're going to send it to the machine shop, let them do all that. My dad used to replace the brass valve guides in Volkswagen bug cylinder heads, and what he would do is they were actually, since the cylinder heads were aluminum, the valve guide would be in there real tight, and it would have a little step on it, and it would go down in there, and you know the head, you know, it'd come out the bottom like that, and of course the valve went through there. And what he would do is he would tap, you know, you got, obviously this is hollow, but he would tap threads in there, in that brass. And he would screw a bolt in there where he'd tap the threads, and then he would get a punch and come down through here and set it on the head of that bolt, and he would beat that valve guide out of there. And then he had a little step punch that was made specifically for installing valve guides that went down in there like that. he'd have his new valve guides. You know where he kept his new valve guides? He had a whole bunch of them in stock all the time. He kept them in the freezer. Lay them in there on the ice so they'd be littler. And then he would take them, the cylinder head, and set it up on his bench, and he'd beat them valve guides down in there. He didn't even have to ream them. A lot of the times when he put valve guides in there, they have to use a reamer to match them to fit, to where they'll have the right kind of clearance. So if you just put the valve guides in there, a lot of times the valve won't even go in it. So you have to ream it out so it's a perfect fit, you see. And that's just a little bit of, and I won't charge any extra for all that, 'cause I don't know if they talked about that in the book or not. But there's special tools for reaming them and everything. And then the kingpin bushings on steering and stuff used to have to be reamed. I had to put those in there. I had to ream the dadgum things out. I didn't have a reamer for that one time when I put some kingpin bushings in something. And I had to get some really coarse brake hone rocks and hone that thing out using, took me 45 minutes. But I got them things where they were so perfect. With the reamer, you can do it real fast, Okay, Technician A says to cut the valve face in an interference angle that is typically 1/2 to 1 degree different from the angle on the valve seat. Technician B says sodium-filled valves are machinable. Who is correct about that?
Okay.
Only number A. Only number A is correct. Technician A is correct. If you piddle around and try to machine sodium-filled valves and you get into the sodium, you typically have a fire and sparks and explosion, this kind of thing. Not particularly good on that. The customer is concerned about the cloud of blue smoke that occurs after starting the engine. The technician will check for what?
One piston.
No.
One valve guide, seals or guides.
Yeah, worn valve seals or guides is what we're going to have there. Whenever I first came to work here, Alan Cobb was driving this 93 Toyota Camry that had about 220,000 miles on it. And when he cranked it up, when he got to leave, it filled the whole parking lot up with smoke. How does this happen? Why does it happen? Talk to me, y'all. What do valve stem seals do? Something else that valve stem seals do is they'll cause it to smoke when it's idling. You idle a long time, the more it idles, the more it'll smoke. And, how do you know that you're, not doing the ring thing? The rings aren't going to make it smoke any worse when you first start it than they are, they go smoke all the time. You get rings, and the heavier you load it. So you got oil puddling up in there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, some of that oil is going to go down in there. It may puddle up, past them valve stem seals because they're all hard and everything, and it goes down in there and it puddles up on the valve. When you crank it up, all of that oil goes into the combustion chamber and it goes right on out the back. Well, why do exhaust valves don't typically, when you're idling, intake valves will pull oil past them because they got low pressure in the intake stream, right? Exhaust valves are not typically going to do that because they don't have low pressure around the valve area, not to amount to anything. So you're going to be sucking oil past those seals. You better use some good ones. If you're putting valve stem seals on one, get some really, really good valve stem seals because you don't want to have to go back and do that again. You can do it with the vehicle in the car. We did the ones on the Camry with the vehicle in the car. How many of you know about scissor gears? Scissor gears are two gears they look like one gear, but it's kind of split. And in between these two halves of a gear, they got a spring. And before you take, like on that Toyota Camry out here, I could take that scissor gear. If you don't put a bolt in through these two scissor gears to hold them, when you take that camshaft out of there and you put it back, that scissor gear if you don't have a bolt to hold them where they won't do this, they'll go boom, they'll jump one. And the reason they got scissor gears is because camshafts, if you've turned a camshaft with a wrench, right, and it goes doom, 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 doom. Well, it does that when the engine's running too. If there's any lash between those gears at all, it's going to make a hammering noise. So I had one student in here one time that didn't put the bolt in the scissor gears. When he put the camshaft back in, it would go brrrr, it would make that engine, from under the valve cover, it made a horrible hammering noise. Well, those spring-loaded gears, the teeth are always pinching the other teeth on the other camshaft because the two camshafts are meshed together. You got one gear on the outside, two camshafts meshed together. If you don't have scissor gears in there, then it's going to cause this hammering. On the old Volkswagen Bug, they used to have 5 different, it was 0, and then they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 minus, different angles of camshaft grind. So you had to select a camshaft. You replaced it when you put building the engine so that the gear did not have any lash at all. You don't want any lash in the gear at all, because if you didn't have any If you had any lash on that gear at all, it would make a loud, ugly hammering noise while the engine was running. Wouldn't hurt anything. It's noisy though. Get out. Most people don't care for that. So anyway, just keep that in mind when you start hearing a hammering noise. A lot of the times they use phenolic gears on camshafts because it doesn't make as much noise. How many of you guys have heard these? You know how you on these hot rodders? Lee, you've probably been here, where you take your timing chain off and you put some additional gears in there. You know, and you do that straight, and it's noisy. Step a technician should take when reconditioning a cylinder head is careful disassembly and inspection of the cylinder head and related components. Now, Amanda and Lee found reason to replace the cylinder heads they pulled off that van the other day because they had big old ugly cracks all over them, didn't they? Technician B says some cylinder head components need to be returned to their original locations to prevent premature failures. In other words, they need to be put on the same place you took them off of the motor.
That is probably true also. So
Yeah, typically you're always better. Did you know what they teach if you manufacturer schools teach that when you take the drive shaft out of a vehicle, particularly if it hasn't been worked on before, is you mark the drive shaft so you're putting it back exactly like it came out. And when you take the brake drums off, you mark the brake drums so you're putting them exactly on there like they came off. You know, that way you don't create a vibration that you have to track down. You know, or you eliminated that. Wake up, Greg. All right. All right, there we go. Let me see. To determine the valve guides, what type of test is used? What type of test is used? Adjustment too tight? Excuse me, I'm reading the wrong answers. Haha, that would have messed us up on it. A dry compression test, a cylinder leakage test, an engine vacuum test, or a wet compression test?
Engine vacuum test.
You'll mean an engine vacuum test, right? All right. Causes of burned valves include all of the following except adjustment too tight, excessive guide wear, excessive spring tension, or valve sticking in the guide.
This is spring tension maybe?
Yes, excessive spring tension is the except. There's an exception. Excessive spring tension is not going to make the valve burn. I was when I used to work, these little Ford Rangers had 2-liter engines and a carburetor on them. People would complain that they would cut up and quit going down the road. And when I'd get one of those things, I would get on that car and or that truck and I'd head off toward Ozark. And I'd just drive and drive and drive and drive. Then I'd start losing power and it would, start skipping and it'd cut up and it'd pull over beside the road. And when I went to spin it over, it would not have any compression on some of the cylinders. And then if I kept sitting there, the compression would come back and then it would start and run. I'd drive it back to the shop and I'd say, this needs a valve job. Well, what happened was the valves would stick. They would stick open when it got good and hot. And that was a problem that those 2 liters gave for a while. And that was, one time I was driving a Mercure XR4 Ti. It was really old and junky and wore out and just horrible shape. And I was on a test drive checking it for something. I can't remember what I was checking it for. And so here I was driving this ratty old beat up car, and I pulled up over there, and I was sitting at a traffic signal over there close to on Denton Road, and it started knocked up right there in the road. And so I got out and I'm leaning on the side of the car. There was no cell phone for me in those days. I didn't have one. And Mrs. Bondi, who owned the dealership, came pulling out of that subdivision there in her $140,000 Mercedes. And she rolls the window down and, with her German accent, she asked me, hey, do you want me to call Robert and have him send somebody after you? And I said, yeah, I'd like that. I'm sort of dead in the water here. And so she opened this little panel in the middle of the dash on her Mercedes. There was a cell phone built in there. And she dialed the number, and it was this was like in 1993. It was a long time ago, But anyway, I never forgot that. I never have seen a car with a cell phone built into the dash, right above the radio before that one, But,
Not everybody got it.
I know. But anyway, the flat wound damper inside a valve spring is there to reduce what? Harmonic vibrations. How many of you seen those? It looks like you got a spring within a spring, right? What's harmonic mean? Harmonic vibrations. Anybody got a harmonic? I guess it picks up a resonance
All you gotta spill is
and causes it to vibrate. when both valves are open at the same time, and what's it called? Overlap. Okay, what do you know? Let me ask you this. Let's say you've got the valve cover off of an engine and you turn the engine very slowly until you see the valves at overlap on a particular cylinder. In other words, you see that both of the one of the valves is closing and the other one starts to open while the other one hadn't quite closed. If you stop right there, where's the piston?
Coming up.
Mechanically think about it. Where your piston is, you got your intake, your compression, your power, and your exhaust. You're at a particular place in one of those strokes when your valves are in there, or both open a little bit. Think about why. Let's back up. Why do we have overlap? Why do we even do that?
Fresh air push exhaust air out.
Exactly. So what's that telling you? Where's the piston?
On the back of the top of the center.
You're right. It's a top dead center on stroke.
Exhaust.
Exhaust stroke. Top dead center exhaust stroke. Okay. Now hear this. We talked a lot about finding top dead center on pistons. If you find the companion cylinder and you get that one to the place where overlap is, you're almost dead on top dead center exhaust, so your companion is going to be on top dead center compression. You got that? All right, that makes sense. Now then, so I just wanted to want you to think about that. The automotive manufacturer recommends technicians use a blank scraper to clean gasket material off aluminum components to prevent damage. A plastic scraper. It better be a good one too. To check a cylinder head for warpage, check the head surface lengthwise and what using a straight edge.
Diagonal.
Diagonally, that's correct. Number 18, some manufacturers will allow the use of a blank disc or a cookie on a die grinder as long as the material is suitable for the job. Abrasive disc. All right, just a second here. If abrasive discs are allowed, the technician must be sure to specify a soft white plastic disc with white grit abrasiveness. 120, that's the number you're looking for. And then cylinder head cam blank should be checked for an out around condition.
Shaft.
Bores. Cam shaft? You think a camshaft's going to be out around anyway, right? As far as the lobes. So, all right.